Amelia's small hands trembled as she clung to the display case, her cheek stinging from the slap that echoed through the jewelry store. The accusing glare of the seller bore into her, branding her a thief before her tear-streaked voice could plead her innocence. "A girl like her doesn't belong here," the woman sneered, words sharp enough to cut deeper than the sting of her palm. But just as the world seemed to turn against Amelia, the store doors burst open, the chilling roar of an engine announcing the arrival of someone who would shift the balance. The man who stormed in was no mere customer. He was her father, and unbeknownst to the seller, the owner of the very store she ruled with misplaced authority. What happens next will leave you breathless. Before we dive into the heart of this gripping story, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. If you're as captivated as I am, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. But before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another gripping story. Amelia's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as she crouched behind the glass display case, her small fingers clutching the edge for balance. Her cheek still stung from the slap, and the metallic taste of fear coated her tongue. The once familiar jewelry store, a place of sparkle and warmth, now felt cold and suffocating. Ms. White's voice echoed through the stillness, sharp and cutting, like shards of broken glass. "She's nothing but a thief," Miss White sneered, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she paced with theatrical indignation. "Caught her red-handed, officer. A girl like her doesn't belong in a place like this." Amelia dared a glance upward. The store's grand chandelier seemed to mock her, its light refracting off the diamond necklaces and earrings like 1,000 accusing eyes. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her throat felt dry, her words trapped behind the lump of panic that refused to dissolve. The two police officers stood by the entrance, their stern faces shadowed under the glare of the overhead lights. One of them, a burly man with a graying mustache, stepped forward, his gaze narrowing as it landed on Amelia. His partner, a younger officer with a crisp uniform and nervous energy, hung back, shifting his weight uneasily. "Miss White, we need facts," the older officer said, though his tone suggested he'd already made up his mind. "What exactly happened?" Miss White crossed her arms, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against her elbow. "She knocked over a display case, tried to pocket a diamond earring. I caught her in the act." "That's not true!" Amelia's voice finally broke free, trembling but determined. She scrambled to her feet, her wide brown eyes brimming with tears. "It was an accident. I didn't steal anything." Miss White scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Accident, my foot. You expect us to believe that?" The younger officer shifted again, glancing at Amelia with what might have been a flicker of doubt. "Ma'am, do you have security footage of the incident?" he asked, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. Miss White hesitated, her confidence wavering for the briefest of moments before she waved dismissively toward the cameras mounted in the corners of the store. "Of course, but there's no need for that. I saw her with my own eyes." The older officer grunted, stepping closer to Amelia. His imposing frame towered over her, and she shrank back instinctively. "Young lady, we'll need you to come with us. We'll sort this out downtown." "No, please," Amelia cried, her voice cracking as she clutched the edge of the display case. "I didn't do anything wrong. Please don't take me away." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The officer reached for her wrists, his grip firm as he snapped the cold, unyielding handcuffs into place. Amelia winced, the metal biting into her skin. The sight of her reflection in the polished glass, small, terrified, and powerless, made her chest tighten with despair. Miss White stood back, her expression smug, arms folded as if she had just rid the world of a great menace. "Good riddance," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Amelia to hear. As the officers began to escort her toward the door, the sound of screeching tires outside cut through the tension. A sleek black car pulled up sharply in front of the store, its engine growling as it came to an abrupt halt. The door flew open, and a man stepped out, his tailored suit as sharp as the fury etched across his face. "Stop right there!" Mr. Johnson's voice boomed, commanding and unyielding. He strode into the store, his eyes immediately locking onto Amelia, then shifting to the officers. His presence filled the space, and even Miss White seemed to shrink under his piercing gaze. Amelia's heart leapt at the sight of her father. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice a mix of relief and anguish. "What in God's name is going on here?" Mr. Johnson demanded, his tone icy and laced with authority. He turned his gaze to Miss White, who paled visibly, and then to the officers, whose hands faltered on Amelia's shoulders. Miss White stammered, "Sir, I didn't realize—" Mr. Johnson cut her off with a sharp gesture. "You didn't realize what, exactly? That the child you just accused and humiliated is my daughter? That you've overstepped every line imaginable?" The room fell silent, the tension palpable as all eyes turned to Mr. Johnson. He took a step closer, his towering presence a shield between Amelia and the world that had turned against her. His voice lowered, but the anger simmering beneath each word was unmistakable. "Take those handcuffs off her, now." The officers exchanged uneasy glances before fumbling for the keys. The younger one unlocked the cuffs, his hands trembling slightly as he stepped back. Amelia rubbed her wrists, the sting of injustice still fresh, but the sight of her father standing firm gave her a flicker of hope. Mr. Johnson's gaze shifted to Miss White, his expression darkening. "You've made a grave mistake," he said, his voice steady but lethal, "and you will answer for it." As Amelia clung to her father's side, the weight of the moment settled over her. This was only the beginning. The stillness in the store was shattered as Ms. White, her face pale but her expression defiant, stepped forward. Her voice cut through the air with the precision of a blade. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her tone measured but tight, "I was simply doing my job." The girl was behaving suspiciously, hovering near the display case, her hands too close to the merchandise. Amelia clutched her father's arm, her small frame trembling as she looked up at him with pleading eyes. "Daddy, I didn't mean to knock it over. It was an accident." Mr. Johnson held up a hand, silencing her gently but firmly. His focus was on Miss White. "Hovering near the merchandise?" he repeated, his voice low and deliberate. "You mean admiring the jewelry in the store her family owns? Is that what you find suspicious?" Miss White faltered, but only for a moment. "With all due respect, sir, I don't think anyone should receive special treatment. Rules are rules, regardless of—" "Rules?" Mr. Johnson's voice hardened. "Are rules also the justification for slapping an 11-year-old child? For assaulting her before verifying any facts?" At this, the officers shifted uncomfortably. The younger one, Officer Harris, cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson, we were called here to respond to a theft allegation. We're just doing our duty. If there's been a misunderstanding—" "A misunderstanding?" Mr. Johnson snapped, his gaze turning toward the officers. "Let me make this very clear. There was no theft. My daughter accidentally brushed against the display case, and that woman," he pointed directly at Miss White, "took it upon herself to act as judge, jury, and executioner. Is that how you conduct investigations? By arresting a child without evidence?" The older officer, clearly more seasoned and less rattled by the confrontation, raised a hand. "Sir, we're happy to review the security footage and clear this up." "Now you want to look at the footage?" Mr. Johnson shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You didn't think to do that before humiliating my daughter in public?" Miss White interjected, her voice trembling but still defensive. The earring fell. She reached toward it. "What else was I supposed to think? That she was just curious?" "Yes, Miss White," Mr. Johnson said icily. "That's exactly what you were supposed to think. But instead, you jumped to the ugliest conclusion possible." At this point, Officer Harris moved toward the counter where the security monitor was mounted. "Let's get this sorted," he muttered, plugging in a small device to access the footage. The screen flickered to life, displaying the store's interior from multiple angles. Everyone crowded around, the tension thick as the images began to roll. The footage revealed a clear sequence of events. Amelia, wide-eyed and fascinated, leaned closer to the display case, her elbow accidentally brushing against the glass. The diamond earring tumbled onto the velvet shelf, but Amelia quickly pulled her hands back, her expression one of innocent surprise. There was no attempt to pocket the jewelry, no hint of wrongdoing. Miss White's face turned ashen as the truth played out in front of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but found no words. "Anything to say now?" Mr. Johnson asked, his voice heavy with anger. Before Miss White could respond, Officer Harris spoke up. "It's clear the girl didn't attempt theft," he admitted, his tone apologetic. "We shouldn't have acted so hastily." Mr. Johnson's gaze shifted to Officer Harris, his expression stern but slightly softened. "Hasty decisions like this cost people their dignity, their sense of safety. Do you understand that? My daughter will carry this moment with her for a long time." The older officer, Officer Grant, nodded solemnly. "We'll include this in our report, sir. And we deeply regret the way this was handled." Amelia clung to her father, her tears now silent as she watched the adults argue over what should have been a simple moment of curiosity. For her, the store, a place she once considered a magical haven, now felt tarnished. Mr. Johnson knelt beside his daughter, his voice gentler now. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," he whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong, and everyone will know that." Amelia sniffled, nodding weakly. But the bruise forming on her cheek told a different story, one of wounds that would take more than words to heal. "Miss White," Mr. Johnson said as he stood, his tone sharper now, "your actions today were not only inappropriate, they were cruel. You humiliated a child, you lied to the police, and you allowed your prejudice to guide your judgment. I cannot and will not allow someone like you to represent this store." Miss White's eyes widened, panic finally breaking through her composed facade. "Mr. Johnson, please, I made a mistake, but I was only trying to protect your business." "Protect it," he echoed, his voice rising. "From my daughter? The only threat to this business is you." Miss White opened her mouth to argue, but the words stuck in her throat. Mr. Johnson turned to the officers. "This isn't over. I expect a formal apology to my daughter and a full investigation into this matter. Now, if you'll excuse us, I'm taking my child home." As he led Amelia toward the exit, Miss White stood frozen, her career crumbling before her eyes. The officers exchanged looks, unsure how to proceed. For Amelia, the walk out of the store felt like a victory and a defeat all at once. She had her father by her side, but the trust she'd once had in this place was gone. Outside, as the cool evening air hit her face, she exhaled shakily, clutching her father's hand like a lifeline. The air in the store seemed to thicken with tension, the weight of Mr. Johnson's words hanging heavily between them. Miss White, her confidence clearly shaken, took a step back. Her once composed demeanor began to crack, her lips tightening into a thin line as her gaze darted between Mr. Johnson, the officers, and Amelia. But instead of apologizing, she lashed out. "Fine," she hissed, her voice rising with venom. "You think you're untouchable because you own this store? That doesn't give you or your daughter the right to disrupt the workplace or treat me like dirt. And don't think I'm the only one who's noticed. People like you always think the rules don't apply." Mr. Johnson's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He held his ground, his voice cold but steady. "Careful, Miss White. You're not just digging a deeper hole for yourself. You're showing everyone exactly who you are." Amelia shrank behind her father, her small hand clutching his tightly. But Miss White wasn't finished. Her gaze snapped toward Amelia, and with a sneer that twisted her features, she spat out, "You're just a spoiled little brat playing dress-up in a world you don't belong in." The word struck like a slap, and then came the real thing. Before anyone could intervene, Miss White lunged forward. Her hand swung out, connecting sharply with Amelia's cheek. The slap echoed through the store, a sound so stark and sudden it left everyone frozen for a split second. Amelia cried out, stumbling backward and landing hard on the marble floor. The tears that had been silently trailing down her face now came in a torrent as she clutched her reddened cheek, her eyes wide with fear and shock. "Amelia!" Mr. Johnson's roar shattered the stunned silence. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he gently touched her shoulder. "Are you hurt, sweetheart? Can you hear me?" Amelia nodded through her sobs, but the pain and humiliation were evident in her tear-streaked face. "You've crossed the line," Mr. Johnson growled, his voice low and dangerous. He stood abruptly, his towering frame radiating fury as he turned to face Miss White. "How dare you lay a hand on my daughter?" Miss White's bravado faltered for a brief moment, but her defense came quickly, her voice shrill with panic. "She's a thief! She deserved it! I won't stand here and be treated like I'm the villain when I was protecting the store." "Protecting the store?" Mr. Johnson's laugh was bitter and humorless. "From an 11-year-old child who knocked over an earring by accident? You didn't just cross the line, you obliterated it. This isn't protection, it's assault." The officers stepped forward, finally snapping out of their stunned silence. Officer Grant, the more experienced of the two, took control of the situation. "Ma'am, what you've just done is completely unacceptable. I'm going to have to ask you to stay where you are while we assess the situation." But Miss White, now visibly unraveling, grabbed her phone with trembling hands and punched in a number. "I'm calling the police myself," she announced, her voice a mix of defiance and desperation. "This little thief won't get away with it. They'll see the truth." Officer Harris raised a brow. "Ma'am, we are the police." Unfazed, she continued her frantic call, her voice growing louder and more erratic. "Yes, this is White's Jewelers. There's been a theft. A child tried to steal a diamond earring, and now her father is threatening me. You need to send someone immediately." Mr. Johnson stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? You just assaulted a child, and you're doubling down on your lies?" Miss White ignored him, her frantic tirade carrying on. "No, I don't feel safe. They're ganging up on me. Yes, send backup." The officers exchanged a look, their expressions a mix of frustration and disbelief. Officer Grant stepped forward, placing a hand on Miss White's arm to lower the phone. "Ma'am, that's enough. Filing a false report is a crime, and we already have evidence to the contrary." Miss White pulled away, glaring at him. "Evidence? What evidence? That girl is guilty, and you know it." Meanwhile, Amelia sat on the floor, still clutching her cheek, her father kneeling beside her once more. His anger was palpable, but his focus shifted to comforting his daughter. He murmured soothing words, brushing her hair back from her face as he tried to calm her trembling shoulders. "It's okay, baby," he whispered. "She can't hurt you anymore, I promise." Miss White's tirade continued, but it was clear her grasp on control was slipping. Her voice grew more frantic, her accusations more desperate. "You're all taking their side. This is favoritism. You can't do this to me." Officer Grant sighed heavily, pulling out his notepad. "Ma'am, I suggest you calm down. You're not helping yourself here." But Miss White was past the point of reason. "I'm the victim here. She's the one who—" "Enough." Mr. Johnson's voice cut through the chaos, silencing the room. He turned to the officers, his tone commanding. "Are you going to let this continue, or will you do your job?" Officer Harris nodded, stepping forward to address Ms. White. "Ms. White, you're going to need to stay here while we file an official report. We also need to review the security footage thoroughly." Ms. White opened her mouth to protest again, but Officer Grant held up a hand. "And while we're at it, we'll need to include your actions in this investigation. Assaulting a minor is a serious offense." The color drained from Ms. White's face, her confidence finally crumbling. She stumbled back, her words reduced to incoherent stammers. As the weight of her actions began to settle, the store grew eerily quiet once more. Amelia, still nestled in her father's arms, whispered, "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Mr. Johnson hugged her tightly, his voice firm but full of warmth. None of this is your fault, Amelia. Not a single part of it. For Miss White, however, the storm was only beginning. And for Amelia, the echoes of that slap would linger long after the day's events were done. The shrill wail of sirens pierced the tense silence outside the jewelry store, growing louder as a patrol car screeched to a stop at the curb. Red and blue lights strobed across the polished glass windows, casting distorted reflections over the luxurious displays inside. For Amelia, each flashing light felt like an accusation, a glaring reminder of the nightmare unraveling around her. Inside, Mr. Johnson held Amelia close, his arms a protective shield as they both watched the officers step out of their vehicle. Two uniformed police officers approached the entrance briskly, their boots echoing sharply on the pavement. They entered the store, their presence immediately commanding attention. The taller of the two, Officer Baker, surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. His partner, a younger officer named Torres, looked slightly uneasy, glancing between Miss White, Mr. Johnson, and Amelia with curiosity and caution. "What seems to be the issue here?" Officer Baker asked, his voice steady and authoritative. Miss White wasted no time, her voice rising above the quiet hum of the store. "I'm so glad you're here. I caught this girl red-handed trying to steal a diamond earring. When I confronted her, her father became aggressive and threatened me. I called for backup because I feared for my safety." Her dramatic delivery earned her a sharp look from Mr. Johnson, but he said nothing, choosing instead to let the officers assess the situation. Amelia's small frame trembled against his side as she clung to his hand, her wide eyes glistening with tears. Officer Torres's brow furrowed as he glanced at Amelia, who looked far too innocent and frightened to fit the description of a thief. Still, protocol required him to remain impartial. "Sir," he said, addressing Mr. Johnson, "is this your daughter?" "Yes," Mr. Johnson replied firmly, his tone calm but laced with anger. "And everything you've just been told is a lie." Miss White's indignation flared. "Excuse me? I have every right to call the police when I see someone stealing. Just look at her. She's been acting suspicious since the moment she walked in." Officer Baker raised a hand, signaling for silence. "We'll get to the bottom of this. Sir, would you mind explaining what happened from your perspective?" Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, keeping his composure despite the turmoil simmering beneath the surface. "My daughter was admiring the jewelry when her elbow accidentally bumped into the display case. An earring fell, and before she could react, Miss White here accused her of theft. She didn't stop there. She slapped my daughter across the face and called you to make a false report." Officer Baker's eyes widened slightly at the mention of physical assault. "She slapped her?" He repeated, his tone sharpening. "That's correct." Mr. Johnson confirmed, his gaze steady. "There are cameras in this store that can verify everything I've just said. You can also see the mark on my daughter's cheek." Amelia flinched at the mention of her injury but bravely tilted her face upward, revealing the faint but unmistakable redness on her cheek. Officer Torres stepped closer, his expression softening as he knelt down to her level. "Is that true, sweetheart? Did she hit you?" Amelia hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes. She said I was a thief, but I didn't do anything. I didn't steal anything." Miss White scoffed, her bravado slipping into defensive hostility. "Oh, please. She's just trying to play the victim now. If she wasn't guilty, why was she reaching for the earring?" "Enough," Officer Baker said firmly, cutting her off. He turned toward the counter where the security monitor was still displaying paused footage from earlier. "We'll let the cameras do the talking. Torres, get the footage." Officer Torres nodded, quickly navigating the store's surveillance system. Within moments, the events replayed on the screen in stark clarity. Amelia leaning over the display case, her elbow knocking the glass, the earring falling onto the velvet, and her startled reaction as she immediately pulled her hands back. There was no sign of intent to steal, only an innocent mistake that had spiraled out of control. The tension in the room shifted palpably. Officer Baker exchanged a look with his partner, then turned to Miss White, his expression unreadable, but clearly unimpressed. Based on this footage, it's clear the girl didn't attempt to steal anything. Your accusation appears to be unfounded." Miss White's face reddened, her indignation now mixed with panic. But she... Officer Baker silenced her with a pointed look. "Additionally," he continued, "if what Mr. Johnson says about the slap is true, we're looking at a case of assault." Miss White opened her mouth to protest, but her words caught in her throat. Her once confident demeanor was rapidly disintegrating, replaced by visible anxiety. I was just trying to protect the store. I thought she was stealing. I didn't mean..." "That's enough," Officer Baker said sharply. "Torres, make a note of everything and bring the father and daughter outside to take their statement." Miss White's panic turned to desperation as the officers shifted their focus. "Wait, you can't just take their word over mine. I was doing my job." "No one's above the law, Miss White," Officer Baker replied coolly. "You've made some serious allegations and we'll be investigating them thoroughly." As Officer Torres gently guided Mr. Johnson and Amelia outside to take their statements, Miss White remained frozen in place, her protests growing quieter with each passing moment. Outside, the cool evening air hit Amelia's tear-streaked face, offering a momentary reprieve from the stifling tension inside. She clung to her father's hand, feeling a fragile sense of safety return as Officer Torres knelt beside her once more. "We're sorry this happened to you, Amelia," he said softly, his expression genuine. "We're going to make sure everything gets sorted out." Mr. Johnson placed a protective arm around his daughter, his tone calm but resolute. "I expect accountability for everyone involved," explaining that even if each member of this family was to face his or her worst fears, it had to be conducted. As Officer Torres nodded, the faint sounds of Miss White's protests carried through the store's open door. For the first time that day, Amelia felt a glimmer of hope that justice might finally prevail. The sharp screech of tires against asphalt cut through the evening air, signaling the arrival of an ominous presence. A sleek black car came to an abrupt halt in front of the store, and the tension already thick inside the jewelry shop seemed to coil tighter. The door swung open and Mr. Johnson stepped out, his polished shoes hitting the pavement with purpose. His expression was a storm of fury and resolve, a contrast to the controlled professionalism he typically displayed. Inside, the officers were still questioning Ms. White, whose confidence had taken a considerable hit. Amelia and Officer Torres sat near the store's entrance, the child's small hands clutching the edge of a chair, her eyes fixed on the floor. The faint redness on her cheek remained a glaring testament to the injustice she'd endured. As Mr. Johnson entered, his commanding presence drew every gaze toward him. The store, normally filled with the sparkle of precious jewels and soft lighting, now felt heavy with confrontation. His eyes swept the room, assessing the scene in a single glance. His trembling daughter, the officers, and the increasingly frantic Miss White. "Daddy!" Amelia's voice, fragile but filled with relief, broke the silence. She rushed toward him, and he dropped to one knee, catching her in his arms. For a moment, all his anger was replaced by tenderness as he held her close. "Amelia," he said softly, his voice steady despite the fire in his eyes. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" She nodded, though her trembling hands betrayed her lingering fear. "She said I stole something, but I didn't. I promise, Daddy, I didn't." Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened as he stood, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "I know you didn't," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Then, turning to the officers, he addressed them with icy precision. "Someone had better start explaining what's going on here." Officer Baker stepped forward, his professional demeanor intact. "Mr. Johnson, we were called here for a report of theft. Miss White alleged that your daughter attempted to steal a diamond earring. However, upon reviewing the security footage, it's clear the accusation was unfounded. The incident was an accident." "Unfounded?" Mr. Johnson's voice rose, his fury barely contained. "This woman accused my daughter of theft, slapped her across the face, and then filed a false police report, Is that what you're calling unfounded? Officer Torres interjected, his tone conciliatory. Sir, we understand your frustration. We're taking this matter seriously and will ensure that everything is documented properly. We're deeply sorry for what your daughter has experienced. Miss White, who had been silent during Mr. Johnson's arrival, suddenly found her voice. Mr. Johnson, I didn't realize. Didn't realize what? Mr. Johnson snapped, his glare pinning her in place. That the child you assaulted and humiliated is my daughter, or that your actions are not only unethical but criminal. Miss White stammered, her usual composure shattered. I was just trying to do my job. I thought... No, Mr. Johnson interrupted, his voice cutting through her excuses. You thought you could make assumptions, act on them, and avoid consequences. That ends today. He turned back to the officers, his frustration now directed at them. And you, why did it take my arrival for you to realize there was no case here? Why wasn't the footage reviewed before handcuffing a child? Officer Baker, though visibly uncomfortable, maintained his professionalism. We acted on the information provided by Ms. White. In hindsight, we should have reviewed the evidence sooner, and for that, we apologize. Apologize? Mr. Johnson's voice was sharp. You don't apologize to me, you apologize to her. He gestured toward Amelia, who was still clutching his hand. Officer Torres stepped forward, lowering himself to Amelia's level. Miss Amelia, he said gently, I'm sorry for what you've been through. You didn't deserve any of this. Amelia managed a small nod, but her grip on her father's hand didn't loosen. Satisfied with the officer's apology, but far from placated, Mr. Johnson addressed Miss White again. You've been an employee here for how long? 6 months, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. And in those 6 months, how many other customers have you treated like this? His question hung in the air, heavy and pointed. Miss White opened her mouth, but no words came. That's what I thought, Mr. Johnson said, his tone final. You're fired, effective immediately. Gather your things and leave this store, now. Miss White's eyes widened in disbelief. Mr. Johnson, please, I made a mistake, but I need this job. Spare me your excuses, he replied coldly. You didn't hesitate to accuse my daughter without evidence or strike her in a moment of misplaced self-righteousness. You don't belong here, or anywhere else where integrity matters. Miss White's shoulders slumped and she slowly made her way to the back room to collect her belongings. The officers watched her go, their own discomfort evident. Turning back to the officers, Mr. Johnson's tone shifted once more, now laced with authority. I trust you'll ensure a full report is filed. I expect charges to be pressed for both the assault and the false report. Officer Baker nodded. Yes, sir, we'll handle it. As the officers began to wrap up their investigation, Mr. Johnson knelt down to Amelia's level once more. It's over now, sweetheart, he said, brushing a tear from her cheek. She can't hurt you anymore. Amelia buried her face in his chest, her small frame relaxing slightly for the first time since the ordeal began. But even as he comforted her, Mr. Johnson's mind was racing. This wasn't just about his daughter. This was about a system that allowed assumptions and prejudice to inflict harm. As he held her close, he vowed silently that this wouldn't end here. The tension in the store lingered long after Ms. White disappeared into the back room. Mr. Johnson stood tall, his jaw set as he surveyed the now quiet space. The officers were wrapping up their notes, occasionally exchanging subdued glances. Amelia stayed close to her father, her small hand gripping his tightly, as if afraid to let go. Her red cheek served as a silent reminder of the injustice she had endured. Moments later, Miss White re-emerged, her usual confidence replaced by a mix of defiance and desperation. She clutched her purse tightly, her eyes darting between Mr. Johnson and the officers, searching for some sliver of reprieve. Mr. Johnson, she began, her voice trembling but laced with forced determination. I understand you're upset, but firing me over a misunderstanding isn't fair. I've been loyal to this store, and I was only trying to protect its reputation." Mr. Johnson turned to face her, his gaze unrelenting. "Protect its reputation?" he echoed, his voice calm but seething with controlled anger. "Ms. White, your actions today did nothing but tarnish this store's reputation. You accused a child of theft without evidence, assaulted her, and escalated the situation to involve the police. And now you dare call it a misunderstanding?" She opened her mouth to respond, but he didn't give her the chance. "This isn't about loyalty or protection," he continued. "It's about accountability. You allowed your biases to dictate your actions, and in doing so, you jeopardized the safety and dignity of an innocent child. My child. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a violation of everything this store stands for." Miss White's face flushed with indignation. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Mr. Johnson interrupted, his voice sharp. "And the damage you've caused today is irreparable. This isn't just about what you did to my daughter. It's about the message your actions send to our customers, to our employees, and to the community. Prejudice and rash judgments have no place here." "But," Miss White tried again, but her words faltered under the weight of his unwavering stare. "You've left me no choice," he said firmly. "Your employment here is terminated effective immediately. Collect your things and leave." The finality in his tone silenced her protests, though her eyes burned with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She turned to the officers, as if hoping they might intervene on her behalf, but they remained impassive, focused on their paperwork. "This isn't right," she muttered, her voice low but audible enough to carry through the room. "I was doing my job, and now I'm being punished for it? Do you know how hard it is to find work in this economy?" Mr. Johnson's expression didn't waver. "Do you know how hard it is for an 11-year-old girl to be accused of something she didn't do? To be humiliated and hurt because of someone else's arrogance? I have no sympathy for your excuses." Miss White's composure finally cracked. Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment she seemed at a loss. But then, as if grasping for a last shred of defiance, she said, "You'll regret this, Mr. Johnson. I won't go quietly." Mr. Johnson's response was as calm as it was cutting. "The only thing I regret is hiring someone who lacks the integrity to admit when they're wrong." The silence that followed was deafening. Miss White glared at him one last time before storming toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She paused at the door, as if expecting someone to call her back. When no one did, she pushed it open with a forceful shove and disappeared into the evening. For a moment, the store seemed to exhale. The oppressive weight of her presence lifted, leaving behind an atmosphere of strained relief. Mr. Johnson turned to the officers. "I assume you'll include this in your report?" Officer Baker nodded. "Yes, sir. Ms. White's actions will be documented and will proceed with the appropriate charges." "Good," Mr. Johnson said, his tone still firm but now edged with exhaustion. "I want this handled properly. She needs to be held accountable." The officers exchanged a few final words with him, then approached Amelia. Officer Torres knelt again, his voice soft. "Amelia, I'm sorry for what happened. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again, okay?" Amelia nodded, her voice too small to form a response. She clung to her father's hand, her trust in the adults around her still fragile. After the officers left, the store fell into a quiet stillness. Mr. Johnson knelt beside Amelia, his eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said gently. "But I promise you, things will change. No one will ever treat you like that again." Amelia nodded, her tears finally beginning to dry. "I just wanted to look at the earring," she whispered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Mr. Johnson pulled her into a tight hug. "You did nothing wrong, Amelia. None of this was your fault. Remember that." As he held her close, the weight of the day began to settle over him. This wasn't just a personal battle. It was a reflection of a larger issue. He vowed to himself that he would use this incident to spark change, starting with his own store. For now, though, he focused on the most important thing: his daughter. Together, they stepped out of the store into the cool night air, leaving behind a day neither of them would forget. As the doors of the jewelry store closed behind the officers, the rhythmic click of their boots echoed on the pavement outside. Officer Baker and Officer Torres stood by their patrol car, reviewing their notes under the cold glow of the streetlights. Mr. Johnson approached them, his shoulders squared and his expression unwavering. "We're not finished," he said, his voice steady but firm. Amelia remained at his side, her hand still gripping his, though she seemed calmer now that the ordeal inside had ended. Officer Baker straightened, meeting Mr. Johnson's piercing gaze. "Sir, we understand your concerns, and we're committed to addressing the situation appropriately. Charges will be filed against Miss White, and a thorough report will be submitted." Mr. Johnson nodded, but his stance didn't soften. "I appreciate that you're taking action now, but I want to know why this happened in the first place. My daughter was handcuffed and treated like a criminal without evidence. If I hadn't arrived when I did, she might have been taken to the station, traumatized further, for something she didn't do." Officer Torres shifted uncomfortably, his young face reflecting a mix of regret and unease. "You're right, sir," he admitted. "We should have reviewed the security footage before taking any action. That was a mistake on our part." Mr. Johnson's gaze didn't waver. "A mistake? That mistake could have left permanent scars on an innocent child. It's not enough to admit it was wrong. You need to ensure it doesn't happen again." Officer Baker cleared his throat, his more seasoned demeanor taking over. "Mr. Johnson, I won't make excuses. We responded to a call and we acted on the information we were given. In hindsight, we should have approached the situation differently. Moving forward, I'll be filing a recommendation for additional training within the department, specifically addressing how we handle incidents involving minors." Though his words were measured, Mr. Johnson wasn't entirely appeased. "And what about the implicit biases that allowed this to escalate? Would you have reacted the same way if it were someone else's child? Someone who didn't look like mine?" The weight of his question hung in the air, pressing down on the officers. Officer Torres opened his mouth to speak but faltered, clearly uncertain how to respond. Officer Baker exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly under the strain of the confrontation. "I can't answer that definitively, sir, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But I can promise you this. We'll include everything in our report, and we'll push for a review of our protocols. Accountability is important to us, too." For a moment, Mr. Johnson was silent, his eyes locked on the older officer. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Words are a good start, Officer Baker, but actions are what matter. I expect this department to hold itself to the same standard of accountability you expect from the people you serve." "We understand," Officer Baker replied, his tone earnest. "And you have my word that we'll follow through." Amelia tugged lightly on her father's hand, drawing his attention back to her. Her face, though still weary, held a glimmer of hope. "Daddy," she whispered, "can we go home now?" Mr. Johnson softened at her voice, crouching to meet her eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll go home now." He rose and turned back to the officers one last time. "I'll be following up," he said firmly, "not just about this case, but about the broader changes your department needs to make." Officer Torres nodded, his expression earnest. "We understand, sir, and again, we're sorry for what Amelia went through. She didn't deserve that." With that, Mr. Johnson guided Amelia toward his car. The officers watched them go, their postures tense, knowing they had been called to account in a way they wouldn't easily forget. As Mr. Johnson opened the car door for his daughter and helped her into the seat, he glanced back at the officers. He knew this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. There were systems to challenge, policies to change, and biases to confront. But for now, his priority was Amelia, ensuring she felt safe and loved after a day that had tested her innocence and resilience. As the car pulled away, the two officers remained standing under the streetlights. The weight of their failure lingered, but so did the promise of reflection and the need for improvement. Mr. Johnson's words echoed in their minds, a call to action that neither of them could ignore. As the patrol car carrying Mr. Johnson and Amelia disappeared into the night, the officers turned back toward the jewelry store. Inside, Ms. White lingered near the counter, her face a mixture of indignation and apprehension. Her earlier bravado had withered, replaced by an uneasy tension as she realized the gravity of the situation. The store's opulent surroundings, which once seemed to elevate her authority, now felt suffocating, closing in with every passing second. Officer Baker entered first, his expression unreadable but his demeanor resolute. Behind him, Officer Torres carried the tablet containing the reviewed security footage. The evidence was undeniable, and Miss White seemed to sense what was coming. She stood stiffly, her arms crossed tightly, as if the defensive posture could shield her from the consequences of her actions. "Miss White," Officer Baker began, his tone formal, "we've completed our review of the security footage, and we've documented the statements from both Mr. Johnson and his daughter." Miss White's chin jutted upward, though her voice betrayed her unease. "I've already told you. I was protecting the store. This is all being blown out of proportion." Officer Torres exchanged a glance with his partner before stepping forward. "The footage doesn't support your claims," he said firmly. "What we see is a child accidentally knocking over an earring, followed by an unwarranted escalation on your part. Furthermore, you physically assaulted her and made a false report to law enforcement. These are serious offenses." The color drained from Miss White's face. Her lips parted as if to argue, but no sound came out. When she finally spoke, her voice wavered. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I thought she was stealing. I panicked." Officer Baker's gaze remained steady. "Intent doesn't excuse your actions. The evidence is clear, and we have a duty to proceed accordingly." Realizing there was no way to deflect the inevitable, Miss White's demeanor shifted to desperation. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I've already lost my job. Isn't that punishment enough?" "No, ma'am," Officer Baker replied curtly. "Your actions go beyond professional misconduct. You assaulted a minor and filed a false police report. These are criminal matters, and they require accountability." Miss White's legs seemed to weaken as the weight of his words sank in. Her shoulders slumped, and she took a shaky step backward, her defiance now replaced with resignation. I didn't think it would go this far," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Officer Torres reached for his handcuffs, his tone softer, but still resolute. "Miss White, you're under arrest for assaulting a minor and filing a false police report. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Her eyes widened, her breath hitching as the reality set in. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for any of this. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," Officer Torres continued, his voice steady as he recited her Miranda rights. "You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided to you." Tears welled in Miss White's eyes as she complied, turning around with trembling hands. The metallic click of the handcuffs seemed to echo in the otherwise silent store. Her composure finally crumbled, and she began to sob quietly, the weight of her decisions bearing down on her. As Officer Torres guided her toward the exit, Officer Baker lingered behind to finalize the documentation. The store, once a space filled with opulence and prestige, now felt tainted by the events of the day. The harsh realities of prejudice, poor judgment, and unchecked assumptions had unraveled in its glittering halls. Outside, the cool night air greeted Miss White as she was led to the patrol car. A few onlookers had gathered, their curiosity piqued by the police activity. She kept her head down, avoiding their gazes, her tears flowing freely now. Her earlier sense of authority and control was gone, replaced by shame and regret. As Officer Torres secured her in the back seat, Officer Baker joined him, the documentation in hand. He glanced toward the gathered bystanders, then back at Miss White. "This isn't just about what happened tonight," he said quietly. "It's about making sure incidents like this don't happen again." Miss White didn't respond, her head bowed in silence. The officers climbed into the patrol car, the engine rumbling to life as they prepared to transport her to the station. As the vehicle pulled away, the jewelry store stood illuminated behind them, its gleaming windows reflecting a bittersweet truth. Justice, though delayed, was finally in motion. But the echoes of the day's events would linger, a reminder of the deep-seated flaws in judgment and the harm they could cause. For Miss White, the journey ahead would be one of reckoning. For everyone else involved, it was a call to action, an opportunity to ensure such mistakes would not be repeated. The evening at the Johnson household was unusually quiet. Amelia sat curled up on the couch, a warm blanket draped around her shoulders. She clutched a steaming mug of hot chocolate in her hands, the rich aroma mingling with the faint hum of the heater. Her cheek still bore a faint redness, but the sting had subsided. Beside her, Mr. Johnson sat with one arm wrapped protectively around her, his other hand resting on the armrest as he stared into the distance. The events of the day weighed heavily on both of them. For Amelia, the store, a place she once considered magical, now felt like a memory tainted by fear and humiliation. For Mr. Johnson, the ordeal had been a harsh reminder of the fragility of justice and the biases that persisted, even in spaces he controlled. "Daddy?" Amelia's small voice broke the silence. She tilted her head to look up at him, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. Why did she think I was stealing? I didn't do anything wrong. Mr. Johnson's heart ached at her question. He paused, searching for the right words to explain the complexities of prejudice without extinguishing her innocence entirely. "Sometimes, sweetheart," he began softly, "people make bad decisions because they let their assumptions and fears take over. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It means they were wrong." Amelia nodded slowly, though the confusion lingered on her face. But why would she assume that about me? Her question hit harder than he expected, and for a moment he struggled to answer. Finally, he said, "Because some people look at others and make judgments based on things that don't matter, like the way they look or where they come from. It's not fair and it's not right. That's why we have to stand up against it." The weight of his words seemed to settle over her. She looked down at her mug, tracing her finger along the rim. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I didn't know what to do." Mr. Johnson pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "It's okay to be scared," he said. "You were brave, Amelia. Braver than anyone should ever have to be in a situation like that." Her lips curved into a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Do you think it'll happen again?" The question hung in the air, and Mr. Johnson knew he couldn't promise her it wouldn't. Instead, he said, "What happened today was wrong, and that's why we're going to do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen again. Not just for you, but for everyone." As the evening wore on, the weight of the day began to lift, replaced by a quiet resolve. Mr. Johnson's mind churned with ideas for changes he needed to implement, not only in his store, but in the community at large. He knew this incident was part of a larger issue, and he couldn't let it go unanswered. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows brought with it a sense of renewal. Mr. Johnson sat at his desk, a notebook open in front of him, as he began drafting a set of new policies for the store. Each measure was aimed at preventing incidents like this from happening again. Comprehensive training for all employees on implicit bias, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and a commitment to creating a welcoming environment for everyone. But his vision extended beyond the store. He reached out to a local community organization specializing in diversity and inclusion training, proposing a partnership to host workshops not just for his employees, but for other local businesses as well. He also contacted a legal advocacy group to discuss pushing for reforms in law enforcement protocols, particularly regarding how officers handle reports involving minors. Later that day, Mr. Johnson called a staff meeting. His employees gathered in the conference room, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding but approachable. "Yesterday," he began, "something happened in this store that I'd never thought I'd see. My daughter Amelia was accused of something she didn't do. She was humiliated and hurt in a place that should have been safe for her. A place that should be safe for everyone who walks through those doors." The room was silent, his words sinking in. "I take responsibility for what happened," he continued, "not because I personally acted, but because I allowed an environment where such actions could occur. That ends today." He outlined the new policies, his tone firm but hopeful. "We have a responsibility, not just to sell jewelry, but to treat every person who enters this store with dignity and respect. That means looking at our own biases, acknowledging them, and working to overcome them." As he spoke, the employees nodded, their expressions shifting from apprehension to understanding. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had transformed. What had started as a place of tension was now filled with a sense of shared purpose. At home that evening, Mr. Johnson shared his plans with Amelia. She listened intently, her young mind processing the enormity of his efforts. "Will it really help?" she asked. "It's a start," he replied, "and sometimes that's all we need to begin making things better." Amelia leaned against him, her trust in him unwavering despite the challenges they'd faced. Together, they looked toward the future, ready to take on whatever came next, one step at a time. Months later, the courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators, community members, reporters, and legal observers filled the benches, their attention riveted on the proceedings. At the center of it all sat Ms. White, her once pristine confidence now replaced by a pale, subdued demeanor. She avoided eye contact with anyone, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. On the other side of the courtroom, Mr. Johnson sat with Amelia by his side. She had grown in quiet strength since the incident, though the memory still lingered. Her hand clutched his tightly, a mixture of nervousness and determination in her eyes. This was more than a trial for her. It was a moment of justice, a step toward reclaiming her sense of safety and dignity. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Security footage clearly showed Amelia's accidental nudge and the subsequent escalation by Miss White. Witness testimonies, including statements from the officers who had arrested Miss White, painted an undeniable picture of prejudice, false accusations, and abuse of power. When the prosecutor delivered the final argument, their words resonated with the room. This is not just about one person's actions. It's about holding accountable those who allow their biases to harm others. We cannot ignore the damage done, not only to a child, but to the trust we place in fairness and truth. Miss White's defense was weak, her earlier justifications unraveling under scrutiny. She offered an apology, but it rang hollow, a last-ditch effort to salvage some semblance of grace. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before delivering their verdict. Guilty on all counts, including a false police report. The judge's sentencing was firm but measured. Miss White was given 3 years in prison and ordered to attend mandatory training programs on bias and anger management. She would also be required to perform community service upon release, working with organizations focused on diversity and inclusion. As the verdict was read, a quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. For Mr. Johnson and Amelia, it was a moment of vindication, though not one they celebrated with triumph. The fight for justice had been hard-won, but it was bittersweet, a reminder of the system's flaws and the work still left to do. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Mr. Johnson, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. He held Amelia's hand tightly as he addressed the crowd. "This case was never just about my daughter," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It was about standing up against prejudice, against the kind of assumptions and actions that hurt people and tear communities apart. Today, we saw accountability, but this isn't the end. It's a step one that we must build upon to create a society where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." Amelia looked up at him, her young face filled with pride. She squeezed his hand, and he smiled down at her, a shared moment of connection and resolve. As the crowd began to disperse, one reporter asked, "Mr. Johnson, do you believe this case will change anything?" He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "I believe it already has," he replied. "Change starts with awareness, with the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. But real change comes when we carry these lessons forward, when we act, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that follow." That evening, as they walked through the park together, the cool breeze rustling the leaves overhead, Amelia broke the silence. "Daddy, do you think people will remember what happened today?" He looked down at her, his expression soft but serious. "Some will, sweetheart. But more importantly, it's our job to make sure they do, by the way we live, the choices we make, and the things we fight for." Amelia nodded, her steps slowing as she gazed at the world around her. The park, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, seemed a little brighter than it had months ago. The fear that had once consumed her was giving way to something new: hope. As they reached the edge of the park, she turned to him with a question that lingered in the air like the fading light. "Do you think the world will ever really change?" Mr. Johnson stopped, crouching down to meet her gaze. "I think the world changes every day," he said. "With every choice we make, every stand we take, and every time someone decides to do what's right instead of what's easy. It's not about waiting for the world to change. It's about being part of the change." Amelia smiled, her heart lighter as she reached for his hand again. Together, they walked toward home, the path ahead uncertain but filled with possibility. The echoes of the trial would linger, but so too would the lesson it carried. Justice is not just an outcome, it's a responsibility, a promise to fight for a better tomorrow. And in that promise lay the seeds of hope, for Amelia, for her father, and for a world still learning to do better. Weeks passed, and the dust from the trial began to settle. Yet the echoes of what had transpired lingered, not only in the Johnson household but also within the community. The case had sparked conversations that rippled far beyond the walls of the courtroom, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about assumptions, fairness, and the weight of unchecked bias. For Amelia, life was slowly returning to normal. She was back in school, laughing with friends and immersing herself in her favorite books. But there was a quiet strength about her now, a depth to her that hadn't been there before. She understood, perhaps more than most her age, that the world wasn't always fair, and that standing up for oneself wasn't just brave, but necessary. One sunny afternoon, Amelia and Mr. Johnson found themselves back in the jewelry store. The familiar sparkle of diamonds and gold felt different this time. Not intimidating or oppressive, but somehow lighter. The staff greeted them warmly, their smiles genuine and their tone kinder, more intentional. "Amelia!" a young sales associate called out. It was Ella, one of the newer hires who had quickly become Amelia's favorite. "I've saved something for you." Ella disappeared briefly into the back and returned with a small velvet box. She opened it to reveal a delicate silver bracelet adorned with tiny, shimmering stars. "A little something to remind you how bright you are," Ella said with a wink. Amelia's face lit up as she looked at the bracelet. "It's beautiful," she said, turning to her father. "Can I?" Mr. Johnson nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Of course. But remember, you don't need a bracelet to remind you of your worth. That's something no one can take away from you." The gesture from Ella wasn't just a kind moment. It was a reflection of the changes Mr. Johnson had worked tirelessly to implement. Since the incident, the store had undergone a transformation. Every employee had participated in comprehensive training on diversity, equity, and inclusion. New policies ensured accountability, and the culture of the store had shifted to one of empathy and respect. But the change didn't stop there. Mr. Johnson's advocacy had extended into the community. Partnering with local organizations, he launched workshops for other businesses, shared his story at town halls, and pushed for reforms in law enforcement practices. Slowly but surely, the ripples of change began to spread. Later that evening, Amelia and Mr. Johnson walked through the same park where they had reflected after the trial. The path ahead was lined with trees, whose leaves swayed gently in the breeze. Amelia's bracelet sparkled in the fading light, a quiet symbol of resilience and hope. "Daddy," Amelia said, her voice thoughtful, "do you think what we've done will make a difference? I mean, really change things?" Mr. Johnson looked down at her, his expression full of pride. "I think it already has, sweetheart. Change doesn't happen all at once. It's like planting seeds. Some will grow quickly and others might take time, but if we keep tending to them, the garden will grow." Amelia considered his words, her brow furrowed in concentration. "So we just have to keep planting?" "That's right," he said, smiling. "And teaching others to plant too." As they walked further, the lights of the town glimmered in the distance, a reminder of the world they were working to make better. For Mr. Johnson, the journey wasn't just about seeking justice for Amelia. It was about ensuring no one else would have to face what she had. For Amelia, it was about understanding her strength, her voice, and the power she held to inspire others. The stars began to dot the sky as they reached their home. Amelia looked up at them, the tiny silver bracelet around her wrist catching the starlight. "Do you think the stars are planting seeds too?" she asked with a small smile. Mr. Johnson laughed softly. "Maybe they are, in their own way, reminding us to keep shining even on the darkest nights." The quiet warmth of their home greeted them as they stepped inside, closing the door behind them. The journey they had embarked on wasn't over. It never would be. But they were ready. Together, they had faced injustice and emerged stronger, their bond unshaken and their determination renewed. The story didn't end with a courtroom or a policy change. It continued in every act of kindness, every lesson shared, and every small step toward a better future. And as Amelia drifted off to sleep that night, her father watching over her, he knew that, no matter how long the road ahead might be, they would walk it together, because the seeds of hope they had planted were already beginning to bloom.